Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's not quite time to say good night yet. We're on the panel that is going to be quite exciting, quite thrilling. It's asking a question, and it's a question that concerns women and girls. Has international law lived up to its promise in advancing the rights of women and girls? My name is Patricia Vizer Sellers. I'm the Special Advisor for Gender at the International Criminal Court, and also I teach international criminal law and human rights law at Oxford University. I'm a practicing professor at London School of Economics. I have a very stellar, exciting panel. Let me present them to you quickly, and then we're going to jump into our discussion. We have Irene Khan, who was the former Secretary General of the International Development and Law Organization from 2012 until 2019. And she was also the Secretary General of Amnesty International from 21 until 29. So, Madam Secretary General is with us. We also have Ajua Kofour. Najua is serving as the advisor on gender and women's rights at the United Nations Office of the High Commission for Rights. I'm sorry, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the regional office in East Africa, and to the African Union. Ajua has been a human rights defender and expert for over 15 years, and she has served in countries such as Afghanistan, Sudan, Nigeria. We have with us also Professor Lisa Davis. Lisa Davis is a professor and co-director of Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic at CUNY, the City University of New York. Lisa has written numerous articles on international human rights law, gender issues, including women's rights and LGBTIQ rights. Lisa's testified in front of numerous legislative bodies and also regional courts. We're very happy to have her here. And finally, we have Ambassador Don Steinberg with us. And Ambassador Steinberg, who formerly was the ambassador to Angola, brings 4 decades of service. He's a very, very young man. I don't know how he did 4 decades of service, but he did it by really representing women at various institutions and the intersection of men. For example, he's currently serving as the board chair of the Women's Refugee Commission. In addition to that, he's the executive director of the program of mobilizing men as partners for women, peace, and security. So this distinguished panel is more than just an understatement. There is so much knowledge and experience that they bring. So let's look at our question again. Has international law lived up to its promise in advancing the rights of women and girls? The question is broad on purpose. In true legal or social science inquiry, each word, such as advance or rights or women, could be dissected to an infinite particle, and any response to the question would still remain, frankly, quite vague and unsatisfactory. I guess the succinct answer to this question is probably no. And you could say that embodied within international law itself and international human rights law, there need only be progressive realization of female rights. And you could say that even the gender jurisprudence that's come out of international courts and tribunals is a jurisprudence that in many ways is based upon precedent. And so many of the legal doctrines are still very nascent. So does our eternal search in international law to always look for custom, does that bind us to the past, and a past that possibly discriminated against women and girls and continues to do so? And even today, when we're drafting gender competent laws and policies, their interpretation or their execution could remain discriminatory. So let's jump in and ask our panelists some questions. The first question is, what are concrete examples of deficits, solutions, maybe blind spots, or even omissions in the advancement of women and girls' rights under international law today? Can I turn to Irene first?
Thank you, Patricia. Uh, well, let me start by saying that international law has come a long way from its past position of gender neutrality or even gender blindness. And today there is a substantive set of norms through treaties, treaty bodies, working groups, and so on. However, the problem is that that normative framework has not translated much, and there is on the ground. And there's a huge gap between the promise and the lived experience of billions of women, whether it's in sexual and gender-based violence or in the arena of family or work or in the political or public sphere. And so where is what you're calling this blind spot? I think we ought to remember that CEDAW, which has been called the Women's Bill of Rights, is a great document, a groundbreaking document, but it is also the most heavily reserved human rights instrument. So there are wide-ranging derogations from international standards permissible under international law. And through those reservations, discriminatory personal law, for example, based on religion or culture, have become entrenched rather than reformed. So that is a huge weakness and a failure of the international legal system to recognize the very special, distinct situation of women. But then if you move to the national level, you also find, in addition to this entrenchment of personal laws and laws based on religion and culture, you also find very patchy legal protection, poor implementation, gender insensitive institutions. And I must say that the neoliberal economic policies and globalization has actually, in increasing socioeconomic inequalities generally, has also had a negative impact on women. So you have these layers and layers of discrimination that have made good laws poorly implemented and bad laws very ineffective.
So well, that certainly explains our problem before, from reservations through patchy implementation. And I think that you're saying that the economic system, and in between that, I think there might be that issue of political will.
Well, there is, of course, political will. There is a power play in the political sphere where women are still struggling to be fully represented in many countries, in many situations, whether in institutions at the international level or at the national level. And so that makes it very difficult to reform these laws. But what you do need at the end of the day is to eliminate discriminatory laws and to make the institutions much more sensitive. And therefore, what I have found in my work and the experience of others with whom I've worked is that one needs a top-down and bottom-up strategy. Where it's working is where there are top-down, you have the legal reforms, you have the institutional changes, but you also have from the bottom up mobilization of women, mobilization of civil society, of progressive forces to change the cultural norms, but also the power structures and institutional behavior.
Okay, but I mean, I just hope we don't get smashed in the middle if we do bottom up and top down.
Well,
I'd like to turn Don now.
But if you smash it up, maybe you start new.
Okay. Oh, bursting. Okay. It's like the hydrogen. We're bursting nuclei. Yes. Okay. Don, I want to ask you that very same question: solutions, deficits, blind spots, omissions in terms of advancement.
Thanks, Patricia. The single lesson I've learned from my work at intersection of human rights, conflict transformation, and development is that we build peaceful, prosperous, and just societies only when we draw on the full contributions of all of our society. Women, people with disabilities, the LGBT community, and other marginalized groups. And so the paradox we face in the women, peace, and security arena is that most of the policymakers and the gatekeepers are people like me, privileged, straight, older men who have little experience directly with exclusion and abuse based on identity factors. And so is it any surprise that we have peace processes that exclude women? That we have a process where the first thing you do at a peace discussion is to grant an amnesty, where men with guns forgive other men with guns for crimes committed against women. That the end of formal conflict often leads to a greater and more pernicious form of violence against women because of failed demobilization and security sector reform. That we completely ignore issues like sexual and reproductive health, girls' education, psychosocial support for the survivors of conflict, economic empowerment for women.
Mhm.
And I think there are basically three factors that contribute to this. First, the basic documents that we have in the Women, Peace, and Security agenda are pretty weak. I'm a great fan of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and its successors, but let's acknowledge that it encourages, it urges, it requests, it doesn't demand. There is no provision for sanctioning government or non-state actors for abusing women. There isn't even a requirement to produce a list of offenders for the purpose of naming and shaming. We don't have a council working group, and there's an absence of time-bound measurable goals in this area. And I would point out to you that in these children in armed conflict area, all of those factors are included in Resolution 1612. Secondly, we tend to look at WPS only through a utilitarian lens. And by that, I mean, we want women at the table because we get better results, more diverse insights, and community ownership. As a result, we tend to overlook the fundamental truth that a seat at the table for women, and preferably a seat at the head of the table, is a non-negotiable human right. And we also forget that, as Irene was saying, you can't achieve progress sustainably unless it comes with changes in gender power dynamics and more inclusive leadership patterns. The final area, which I think we can probably talk about a little more later, is that this whole system continues to be dominated by testosterone-driven global security metrics and provisions. We still obey the survival of the fittest, the traditional militaristic approaches, even to WPS, public posturing, show no weakness strategies, instead of feminist principles, which include international cooperation, prioritization of human security and socioeconomic well-being, flexible and pragmatic policies, transparency, et cetera. So I think we can talk about those issues in the next round, perhaps.
Okay, thank you, Don. I mean, if I can read between your lines, you're basically saying that those who are the rights holders keep reproducing their own power themselves. And 1325, the wonderful document that you're saying is utilitarian, as opposed to being even aspirational, that if it gives women a seat at the table, it does so as if that were a privilege or an option, not a right. But even having a seat at the table doesn't mean that your voice will be allowed to dictate the agenda that will be discussed at the table.
Indeed, there is a difference between diversity and inclusion. Diversity just means you have different points of view and different ethnicities and genders at the table. Inclusion means that they are allowed to influence the decisions that are taken at that table. And that's not even to talk about equity, which is to make sure that those decisions are implemented in a way that's fair and just and has some moral principle behind it.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Ajua. So what do you think would be your vision in terms of omissions or deficits or maybe solutions or just problems that might be prohibiting or making us progress in terms of women and girls' human rights?
Thank you, Patricia. I think many of the areas I was going to touch upon, Don and Irene have articulated it very well. So I want to start by first saying thank you to ASL for the invitation. And I'm very honored to be part of this, as you said, stellar panel. I want to focus then, having listened to our previous two speakers, on looking at what I think is one of the blind spots, but certainly also a solution, which looks at gender stereotypes, the issue of stereotyping, harmful gender stereotyping, and how that forms the basis of, it hinders women, gender equality, and women's rights. And I want to focus on really looking at the space where it's so important to secure the rights, that's in the courtroom. So here are some examples. It is natural for a man to respond to a nagging female partner with violence. Women's demands for equal pay with men for equal skills are not justified because women are likely to stop working to have children. We have a man who kills his wife may receive a lenient sentence if she was unfaithful. These are judges' comments, not from 100 years ago, but in the last 10 years. And these cases were obviously decided where there were deeply embedded notions on the role of women and girls. And justice was denied to these women, as it denied to almost everyone in every courtroom. And in this sense, it's by the struggle, decades of struggle for women's rights to equality. Judicial processes remains the one space where we still face harmful gender stereotypes, which denies women access to justice by the very legal system that are supposed to protect fundamental rights for everyone. I want to say it's interesting to note Article 5 of the CEDAW Convention, which Irene mentioned, requires state parties to modify and transform gender stereotypes and to eradicate the practice of applying typical individuals in ways that violate their rights. This is one of the articles with the most reservations in CEDAW. So even though it's definitely a blind spot, it's also part of the solution. Discrimination in the courtroom is particularly damaging. It undermines equality, which is the foundation of human rights law. And the UN Human Rights Office, we are devoting considerable attention to providing more robust guidance in this area. I want to talk about the deeply entrenched discrimination against women. It's not only generally for women, but for certain groups of women, such as African descendants, for example. Prejudice and deeply rooted stereotypes hampers every aspect of life, from access to land, education, health, to the justice system, economic and political participation. And I'll end by touching upon what we heard earlier from Irene about translating commitments into concrete action, and even in the regional context. Irene, the national, I'll talk about the regional just quickly. We look at in Africa, we have the Maputo Protocol. It is the least reported on instrument by states. The AU Special Rapporteur on Rights of Women in Africa, we talk about resources, allocating adequate resources to gender equality and gender promotion, has no funding for her work, for example. She relies solely on NGOs. What does this mean for the commitment of states' commitment towards the realization of women's rights? Opposition to certain rights, which are the very basic, very foundation of being a woman, sexual reproductive health and rights within regional mechanisms, also continues to hamper women's reproductive rights. And there are other institutions at the national level, such as national human rights institutions, many of which have not mainstreamed gender into their work. And these, again, are the very institutions that are supposed to help us advance the rights of women and girls.
So as you're saying in some ways that gender stereotyping, and even gender stereotyping depending on race, is a form of discrimination. Okay, and so that's undermining the rules and regulations we have. But the Maputo Protocol, which is one of the most beautifully written, drafted international instruments that we have in existence in international human rights law today, its underutility sends a signal. I mean, it doesn't offer protection, but it also sends a signal, maybe getting back to the question of lack of political will, which then translates into lower budgets or no budgets.
Exactly, Patricia. That is we have now 42 ratifications on the continent, but only 6 countries have reported on how they are implementing on the obligations as contained in the Maputo Protocol. And yet, almost all the states have reported to CEDAW. So it's also a question of priorities and the requirement and commitment.
Right, 15% ratification in Maputo and the highest number of reservations with CEDAW. That's not a winning track record at that point. I'm going to turn to Lisa now. Lisa, what do you think are some of the problems or maybe the solutions, deficits, or omissions in terms of advancing the rights of women?
Well, what really stands out to me, Patty, is the lack of jurisprudence under international criminal law, especially when we compare it to the abundance of jurisprudence that we find under international human rights law. So we know that gender persecution under international criminal law is the sister crime to discrimination under international human rights law. But there's really only a few vignettes here that tell us in the jurisprudence of what gender persecution might look like. And in fact, there's never been a single successful case of gender-based persecution in the history of international criminal law. Now, I hope that, really sinks in with everyone, because we've certainly had plenty of recognition of other forms of persecution, such as racial or ethnic persecution, but never gender persecution. And without this jurisprudence, we tend to see this self-fulfilling prophecy that keeps affirming the lack of an ability to see gender persecution in conflict. Now, that doesn't mean it's not there. Certainly, LGBTIQ persons have been persecuted in conflict, as well as women beyond what we would consider sexual violence. The problem is we don't see it. And everyone here knows the most famous case of gender persecution in history. I mean, when you think about it, it should come right up, right? Or is it hard to recognize? And of course, what I'm talking about is the persecution of LGBTIQ people under World War II. We all know about the Pink Triangle and the persecution of gay men by the Nazis. Mm-hmm. But in that story, who's left out are the trans persons and lesbians. We never hear about them. So, technically, lesbianism was never officially criminalized by the Third Reich. Women were in a position of power in Germany, so they weren't seen as a political threat. And lesbians were considered useful breeders under the Third Reich. But we did see some women who were accused of being lesbians and persecuting for it. Or we don't know if they were lesbians or not, but they were accused of it because they transgressed gender norms, such as refusing to get married. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, however, homosexuality was never mentioned in Nuremberg, was only mentioned in the Nuremberg trials in the context of medical experimentation. But the torture and murder of LGBTIQ people was never prosecuted. And following Nuremberg, we really only see these bits and pieces under international criminal law that kind of start to form. These vignettes of discussion on gender in jurisprudence, like from the Yugoslavia and Rwanda tribunals. And they do fall in line. They're just kind of few and far between. So in terms of how both the ICTY and ICTR have considered how transgressing prescribed gender roles and behaviors can be the underlying basis for crimes, we see this in example in the Nahimana case, where Tutsi women were branded as femme fatales, or seductive agents of the enemy. And the court noted this and said that these were motivational factors in the sexual attacks and killings that they experienced. And the same in Yugoslavia for the Kovačka case. They noted similar language holding that sexual violence was a, quote, natural and foreseeable consequence of holding women in detention. I think more importantly in that case is on appeal, the court clarified that personal motivations to commit sexual assault doesn't void the intent to discriminate. However, there was only one case in the ICTY that attempted to bring gender-based persecution charges, but that case ultimately failed.
So Lisa, are you saying that almost at the heart of persecution as a provision under crimes against humanity of international criminal law, that we historically have the facts to bring cases against the very least gay men, but the LGBTQI community? And that was an omission. That was an act of omission. And therefore, we don't have the jurisprudence that relates to that. And as I stated earlier, because of international law, and in particular international criminal law, often being based on customary national law or precedent, once you don't have the precedent and you don't have the custom, then you can perpetuate the discrimination of the omission. Am I just restating what you've said?
I mean, I think that's right. I think it's, we know from the ICC prosecutor's policy paper that gender persecution acknowledges the social construction of gender. So we have that definition. But without that jurisprudence, we just don't have the lens or the tools, and this is the self-fulfilling prophecy, to be able to hold crimes accountable. And we have these crimes. I mean, we see them now, with the example of ISIS, who, persecuted women, doctors who removed their gloves because they interfered with their medical duties. So they tortured them. Or they killed women who had served as local politicians because they didn't think this was a proper role for a woman, or throwing men or women accused of being gay or lesbian either off buildings or, burned alive. So we see these crimes are happening, but we don't have we don't have a lens to really capture them. And if we don't, they're going to be left out of history. I mean, we might get the torture and we might get the murder, but if we don't get why these crimes happened, then we're really not getting to the root causes of conflict, and we can't really do our work on prevention. And that's so critical if we're really going to end these crimes.
And the jurisprudence isn't truthful to the facts on the ground. Look, I want to turn back to Irene, because Irene, you brought up certain issues that are almost institutional. I mean, how do we make our institutions more gender competent? But somewhere I think I can sense that we'll end up talking about gender mainstreaming. Should we add women and mix, or will we end up talking about a form of special measures, affirmative action for women? Or are we talking really about institutional political will that translates into budget? How do we move from here? Because international law lives in institutions, whether they're the UN institutions or international criminal court institutions or the regional institutions.
International law lives in institutions, you're absolutely right, but it's moved very often by people. Civil society has played a bigger role in pushing human rights issues than any other sector. When it comes to women's rights, it's been the women's movement, not even human rights organizations, but women's organizations who came in and put the gender lens on international law. So yes, institutions are important. And I think what has to happen is, in the case of women's rights, as in the case of so many other things, it's the economic concept of supply and demand. Yes, institutions have to change, but institutions change when there is demand from the rights holders and from others to make those institutions change. International law is very remote from people. And if there have been changes in human rights, it's because the human rights machinery of the UN is one of the very few areas of the UN where there is a lot of civil society participation. You don't see civil society in the International Law Commission or even in the ICC Assembly or other places in the same way that you see them, for example, when the UN Human Rights Council is meeting. So there's a big gap between what happens at international law, which is all about state prerogative, and what's happening on the ground to people. And how do you bring the two together? You do that in the national political arena, in the local communities. And therefore, there has to be a lot more sort of de-legalizing the language of what we talk, so that people can be translated into people's experience. And I absolutely agree with Lisa about gender persecution. I worked for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees for 21 years, and we fought to have gender persecution being recognized as a ground for refugee status. And we barely made it in one or two extremely severe cases, because, of course, the fear was that it would open the floodgates. That's what the countries of asylum feared.
The floodgates of what? Of
floodgates. Recognize someone as a refugee, you have to grant the person asylum. So if you recognize gender-based persecution as a ground for seeking asylum, in the same way that you recognize political persecution or ethnic persecution, then the fear was that there would be simply hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of women who could qualify, or other groups would qualify on the grounds of sexual orientation or sexual identity, if you make sex a ground. And there have been very few cases where courts have actually recognized that. And so political considerations come in, and then we go back to the issue of power and patriarchy. How do you change that?
Well, patriarchy isn't a crime. So, I mean, it's,
Patriarchy is not a crime, but it is a form of behavior or a power, a form of power. And it's not immutable. It can be changed. It's part of culture. So it's not only crime. I think we should not look at law as only dealing with crime. Law deals actually in the positive sense with good behavior, with entitlements, with rights, promoting equal societies. And from that context, patriarchy does not promote equal society. It's not about equal protection. It's not about equality. And those are the principles we're talking about, not necessarily just breaking the law.
right. Well, look, I want to turn back to Don because I think you gave us a teaser of something you would come back to. And I understand it might be the Security Council, you were saying, but the Security Council is one of the most formidable in sense of strength institutions within the institution of the United Nations. So what was it that you were dangling in front of us?
I was dangling the concern that I think many of us have that the international global governance system is dominated by testosterone-driven concepts rather than feminist principles. And I have just completed an article which was published about a month ago with Ruth Halpern Kadari from Israel, where we talked about what would have been the response of the global community to the COVID-19 challenges if we had adopted a feminist approach. And that means we had diverse and inclusive leadership, that we had flexible and pragmatic policies based on empirical evidence, that we prioritized human security and socio-economic well-being, that we had international cooperation and coordination, and that we adopted a transparent and a long-term approach towards the issues, as opposed to, national security is militaristic and power-driven, ideology, public posturing, show no weakness, finger pointing. And for me, what would have happened is as soon as we identified COVID-19 as a challenge, the UN Security Council would have declared it to be a threat to international peace and human security. They would have brought China and the WHO and other international experts forward to transparently share information. They would have disseminated that to all the different regional bodies. They would have brought women to the table. And it is absurd, for example, in the United States, 80% of the people who are caregivers and frontline actors in this arena are women. And yet when the COVID-19 task force was put together and the first tweet came out, there were 16 men in suits in the White House and no women. And what the Security Council would have done then is adopted a resolution to mandate global cooperation and coordination. We would have had rapid reaction teams going out to transmission sites and hotspots. You would have authorized the adoption of travel and trade restrictions, but these wouldn't have been unilateral. These would have been collaborative.
Well, Don, aren't you, in some sense, aren't you essentializing women? The good caregivers, and aren't you essentializing men? The military, as you're saying, testosterone driven. Are these being used, as I could see, to be emblematic of ideologies or policies? But the real question I want to get to, it seems to me that you're even modifying the notion, or let me say the concept of what is peace, because COVID-19 would have been a threat to the peace, even though there was no military attack or use of force. There was no even genocide when Rwanda shifted the nature of the Security Council's declaration of a threat to the peace or restoration of the peace. So this is an essential criteria or essential responsibility of the Security Council peace.
Yeah, and for me, it's not peace. It's peace and national security and well-being of societies. If you can really tell me that a situation that has infected 10 million people around the world killed 500,000 people and has brought 100 million more people to the brink of extreme poverty is not an issue of national security for every country on earth, then I don't understand what the terms we're using are. I think this is, in fact, one of the strongest feminist critiques of international law, and that is the narrow definition of national security as only addressing war and peace issues between sovereign states. Feminist international law and political scientists tend to take it much more broadly. They tend to be able to deal with all of the issues that impact human security. And I would go back to the point I made before. I don't really care if the abuse and the killing of women comes in the form of a formal conflict, or whether it comes in the form of domestic violence after conflict that we haven't addressed, or whether it comes in the form of denying sexual and reproductive health care to individuals. It's all the same. It's violence, and it's a threat to the peace and security of our world.
Okay, thank you, Don. I'm going to move back to Jua and then to Lisa before we open up to our audience. But already I'm seeing what could almost be seen as looking at the lived lives of women, but women also saying, let's look at the lived lives of all human beings as a way to advance rights. But Jua, I mean, what are your thoughts, I mean, on this almost type of intersectionality of all of our aspects of lives in terms of advancing women's human rights and that of girls also?
Thank you. I think let me take, for example, when it comes to intersectionality, the example of African descendants, women of African descendants, and let's look at that. And let's look at the importance of ensuring, when looking at intersectionality, that women are looked at as a whole. So in this case of African descendants, for example, let's look at race and the issue of gender and the importance of looking at gender-related dimensions of racial discrimination, namely the circumstances in which racial discrimination only or primarily affects women or affects women in a different way. This type of discrimination, for instance, in talking about this particular intersectionality, is deeply entrenched. And when these two forces meet, and it's not only women of African, it's not race, gender, and disability, is migrant status, race and education, gender and education, all these different layers. When they intersect, they reinforce each other. And I think we said that earlier. And it's a dynamic that, of course, affects women with these multiple forms of identity and perpetuates inequality from generation to generation. And if you don't look at it with the intersectional lens, this type of discrimination often goes undetected. And it requires, and then there'll be, of course, no explicit recognition or acknowledgement of the different life experiences of women and girls in all their diverse. I'm focusing, as I said, on looking at intersectionality when it comes to African descendant. And for example, we have cases here where in the UK, for instance, where I'm speaking from today, Black women are 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth, for example, compared to white women. And Don mentioned the COVID situation and having, if you had a feminist lens, we know this has been the COVID has laid bare different impacts of health outcomes for different women, and where you don't look at women with an intersectional lens. A recent study in the UK shows that women from ethnic minority background are 4 times more likely to be hospitalized with the virus than white women. And that for pregnant women, being from ethnic minority is a major predicator.
So the women's rights are inextractable from the rights that we look at in terms of racial groups, and then the rights we must look in terms of economic groups, and then the rights we must look at in terms of geographically situated groups. I want to turn to Lisa. And Lisa, I'm going to give you our first question. And it has come in, and you see you might see it on your screen, and it says, is there a tension between the value of international norms that are not gender blind and problems with defining gender as binary? And how should we advocate for better protection for women while furthering international protections for the full gender spectrum? This seems to fold into the persecution question.
Well, I think that is such a great question. And I'm so glad it was asked. I think that, part of the problem of not recognizing gender crimes during atrocity, and part of it, it's a lack of a gender lens, which I know was also mentioned in the questions earlier, but it's also just an issue of a lack of will and priority. There's a lack of prioritization of these crimes. Irene talked about it in terms of, worrying about the floodgate. Well, when we go to upgrade the language in treaties, such as the new draft Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, so that it reflects the gender spectrum, so that it includes everyone who might suffer from an atrocity. The pushback was, we're not going to be able to get it passed. People aren't going to, states aren't going to want to adopt it. And it makes you stop and think, what's more important, getting a treaty passed that doesn't protect everyone, or waiting to get that treaty passed until we can get it to protect everyone? I mean, where are our values? So I think part of it is a values issue and what we prioritize. In terms of addressing the gender spectrum, I think the great work that's happening at the Office of the Prosecutor is moving in that direction. With the policy paper that we have that defines gender persecution to include, all those different forms of gender expression, we get there. And really, in my opinion, the policy paper, it implies that the binary is also part of that gender prescription that perpetrators put on you when they're enacting gender persecution. The binary is just part of it. It's part of that social construction.
Motivation for the crime. Well, you were mentioning, okay, states are the ones that will vote on the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. And Irene, you were talking about states, and we have one question that says, well, what can we do to hold states accountable for their acts? And the person asking the question was thinking of genocide, but also accountable in other conflict situations, Colombia, Myanmar. And I'm blending two questions now. And how can we get the international community to recognize crimes, to push states? And you spoke about almost what was three-tiered: civil society, institutions, and states. So these seem to be players that interact with women's rights.
Yes, I think the problem is one that Don put his finger on, that the international machinery that is supposed to kind of regulate behavior of states is under attack, has been weakened, is damaged. So the Security Council doesn't work. The ICC is under huge pressure and has not really met the expectations of those who campaigned to have it set up. The tribunals are not fashionable anymore. So it is a real problem to hold the state accountable at the international level now, other than through even resolutions in the UN Human Rights Council. There's a lot of bargaining going on there. So there is a weakening that's undoubtedly going to be, in the medium to long term, very damaging for international law. And therefore, we need to fall back and probably be much more creative about looking at what kinds of institutions we can have. I think the institution of public opinion is a very powerful one. And of course, that is being used. We need to figure out ways in which we can strengthen national institutions, national courts, because we see in countries when political change comes, then they are ready to hold actors accountable that they were not willing to do so previously. So there are openings that we need to be looking at. So I think we need to go multifaceted and not just rely on international law or national law or one or the other. It's a very dynamic situation, and it is a dangerous situation. So we have to keep looking at opportunities everywhere to push, strengthen institutions nationally, do what we can internationally, but also use other creative means to hold governments to account. Naming and shaming is still a powerful tool. And I say that because look at powerful countries like China and others who are so worried about their image. They spend a lot of time and money in trying to protect their image, which means it does work to put public pressure on them.
Don, I saw you raise your hand. Did you want to intervene?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on this question of how do you create institutions that actually work in this space. And I had the privilege of being the deputy administrator at USAID during the Obama administration, where we had this dream team of Hillary Clinton and Milan Vivir and Carla Copel and others who were firmly committed to gender empowerment. And, you know, they would wake up in the morning with new ideas and would call me and tell me, you have to fund this, which is what we did. But we adopted a very clear strategy, which said that there are 4 pillars for achieving institutional change. And they relate to the points that you were making earlier, Patricia. First, you do need to do specific programs to support and empower women and women's groups on the front lines of peace, human rights, and justice in their countries. Secondly, you do need to mainstream and integrate gender into everything you do. And so one of the things we did, for example, was to require a gender impact statement for any major project that we were doing, whether it appeared to be a gender project or not, a health project, building a dam, creating new electricity. Third, we demanded that we be global thought leaders and advocates and partners for other governments with time-bound measurable goals and feedback loops and accountability provisions. And finally, we recognized that we had to walk the walk within our own agency. And so we adopted gender-sensitive hiring and employment practices and widespread training and programs on the elimination of unconscious bias and more inclusive leadership patterns.
Well, Don, I would agree with everything you're saying. And I think that it all has to occur at the same time and work together. The only thing I would disagree with what you're saying is the use of the word gender sensitive. I'm encouraging people to be gender competent and not sensitive. And I think that the standard that we hold ourselves to in terms of our gender competence informs the institution, informs civil society, informs our political posture and political will, which will change governments. I do have another question. I'm seeing it not having been raised quite clearly, I think, in the audience. So I'm going to do some paraphrasing. We've been speaking about women's rights, and are we subsuming girls? Are we collapsing girls into women? Are we not articulating them? Are we somehow committing the very ill thought out collapsing of having human rights represent this man and women are arguing to get in? Are we doing that with girls in terms of female human rights? Ashua, what do you think?
I think it depends in what context. But in my experience, it's very clear that girls or adolescent girls especially have specific needs and are different from women. But of course, girlhood being on a path to womanhood and many of the violations that girls face as girls or as adolescents translate and have long-term impact on their rights as women. But there are different human rights frameworks that cover girls. We have the CRC, and in the regional context, in Africa, again, we have the African Charter on Children, which has specific frameworks and specific protections that are accorded girls that are not necessary for women. So especially when it comes to violence and acting in the best interest of the child, these are very different processes, and the same in conflict settings. And I think Don mentioned some of the resolutions. We have the WPS agenda certainly for women, but there are also children affected by armed conflicts, which has a whole different process and a whole different office, which looks at specifically at some of the violations that girls face. I do understand the tendency, especially when it comes to violence, to conflate women and girls, knowing that for example, if it's a harmful practice, if a girl is denied access to education. This will have a lifelong impact, and this will impact on her prospects as a woman. So many of those
are the rights of girls. I mean, aren't we setting up that girl child and the child up until 18 to have a more difficult time to advocate for her rights as a woman, or to see that she should be a rights holder? I mean, isn't part of the solution within really the recognition of girls when we're speaking about females and making sure it's constantly present and integrated?
I think we will definitely agree with you. It starts with education, human rights education from childhood. What is your rights as a girl child, and then what rights are those? How are you able to claim it, and how are you able to exercise it? That's why I think in our work there is no age that once you reach 18, then we have age of majority, we have age of sexual consent, all these things are and we have the adolescent, which goes beyond 18, or youth. Then you have all these groupings, the youth age, which goes beyond 18, which is different. Of course, the UN age of youth is up to 24, but in other contexts, it's much higher. So there are different things that we talk about when we talk about children. I mentioned we talk about in the best interest of the child, and this takes into account their development.
As a female rights framework, I want to turn to Lisa, because Lisa, you mentioned the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, and one of the questions that has come up is a question of whether the United Nations needs another instrument, but an instrument specifically on sexual violence or violence against women in order to make states accountable. Where would you stand on that?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. It seems challenging to develop new instruments. And in one way, I sometimes feel like we have so many documents and resolutions and instruments that the problem is we never work to actually implement them. So why not start with what we have and work with that first? I mean, we have scores of information and jurisprudence under international human rights law on gender that includes women and LGBTIQ persons. Why not take precedents from there and appropriately translate it into the criminal law context? We have a few things that we can use under international criminal law, but it's not enough. So we need to start working on building more. But that's more about the application of what we have than trying to go out and create something new.
Okay, I saw Irene, you had your hand up on this.
Yes, very briefly. I fully agree with Lisa. I don't think we need new institutions or instruments, but what we do need is pressure. When you think of the death penalty, look at the progress that has been made on the death penalty, the abolition, global abolition of the death penalty. Why can't we take campaigns like that and push that and make those provisions in CEDAW and in the other human rights instruments work for women?
So I think you're back to really that intertwining of the role of political pressure, civil society, and it goes back to also having the voices of females heard, that we develop a voice, that we speak, that it is heard, and then what we say is valued and implemented. And not just a commercial or a break.
Exactly, the voice and the agency of women.
Right. Okay, we're coming up to the end, and I'm going to ask people to go around and give your last, final, brilliant blessings to our audience on what we should do for advancing the rights of women and girls, at least in the next 12-month period. Okay? I'm going to start with Don.
Thank you. And I guess I'll use this as an advertisement for the group that I'm involved with, which is Mobilizing Men as Partners for Women, Peace, and Security. This initiative brings together 250 groups and individuals from the diplomacy, defense, academic, and civil society areas. And we have 4 principal objectives. We use our connections with people in the corridors of power to open the doors for grassroots women from conflict regions who are fully capable of advocating for themselves if we simply open the door and stand by and guide them in. Secondly, we hold global institutions accountable for their WPS commitments, including in this country, the Trump administration for its failure to implement the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017. We strengthen, empower, and protect women peace builders, and we enlarge the community of practice for WPS. We've quietly facilitated contacts for women advocates from Afghanistan and Kurdish Syria, Cameroon, South Sudan, etc. And we provide small grants to women's peace groups in conflict-affected countries. We're a partnership organization. We work with a lot of other groups, and we're always looking for new partners. You can find our charter, our statement of principles, and more information at oursecurefuture.org.
Perfect. So I think men are the perfect allies, men on the entire gender spectrum. And I think that men's advocacy groups should per se be feminist.
Absolutely.
It should be written into every charter for the male group. Azure, you've got 2 minutes to see how we can advance the human rights of females in 2020, 2021.
Thank you, Patricia. I don't think I need 2 minutes. I'll simply say, as we look at the impacts of COVID and as it unfolds in our lives going forward, it's very important that as a human rights system, we look at women in all their diversity and make sure that it's all women that we are taking along the gender, and not just in terms of sexuality and genders in all the spectrum, but also women in all their different manifestations and identities are looked at and given the same importance to the issue of intersectionality. And that is one of the way forward. And also making sure in all aspects of the COVID response, in the planning, in the post-recovery, that women voices are heard, and not only as gender mainstreaming, but as Don mentioned, women are included. Inclusiveness, participation forms the key.
I agree. We're not at the margins, we're at the center. And Lisa, this is your chance. 2 minutes for women's and females' rights in 2021.
Well, I can keep it short. I can just say that crimes committed against women and LGBTIQ persons because they step outside of prescribed gender roles are crimes that all people experience on the gender spectrum. And whether it's a femicide of a woman who decided not to work, decided to work and not marry, or it's a man who's thrown from a building for being perceived as gay, what's important is that we recognize why these crimes happen and why that these crimes happened specifically because people stepped out of oppressive gender roles that were assigned to them. And the good news is we have a strong prosecutor at the ICC who has initiated investigations into gender persecution that are culminating into cases. The bad news is her term is up this year, so we really need to be working on making sure that the next prosecutor follows in her footsteps. And in the meantime, we all need to keep our lens broad. We need to look at the deeper oppression behind acts of gender-based violence and gender-based crimes, because if you look hard enough, you're going to find it. And that's how we can start truly changing the discourse on gender rights.
Thank you. Irene, please.
Well, 2 things. First, budgets. I think we have to make budgets a feminist issue because we have to watch very carefully in the coming months and years where money is being invested, where cuts are being made, because that's going to make a huge impact on women, and women have to be involved in that. And my second point is we should be energized by the activism in the streets. That's what's actually happening. Big change. If this meeting had taken place and it was supposed to take place in April, I would have been quite pessimistic about this issue. But now, seeing what's happening around the world, I'm actually very energized. And that's what needs to happen. Movement on the streets and watch the money.
Well, what a positive note for us to arrive at. So I would add to your budgets as a feminist issue, politics are a feminist issue, and certainly peace is a feminist issue. I'd like to thank all of you, our audience, but in particular our panelists. This has been enlightening. It's even been fun. I think that it has given us a way forward. We can analyze the present and even despair about the past, but I think that we are moving forward. So thank you very much, each one of you, for taking your time and sharing your brilliance.
Thank you.